So, welcome to Ecocriticism 101 and lecture number 14, which is entirely on Henry David Thoreau. We had a little introduction to Thoreau last time, but this time we're going to really dig in deep. Thoreau, the way we're dealing with Thoreau in this class is a little different than anyone else. And what I mean by that is that, well, you're hearing from me only through the lecture. So you're doing readings, you're watching films, but as far as hearing my take on things and getting, content from me, you're getting it through the lectures. But with Thoreau's case, as you know, there's an online edition of Walden that I put together, and I wrote both the preface and the introduction. And the introduction in particular, I took the opportunity to tell you even more about Thoreau. So you're getting part of the introduction to Thoreau from me and part from the introduction to Walden. So do look at both. I tried not to have too much overlap, maybe a little bit, just as it necessitates to make sense in either place. But there is important material in both, and it should go without saying that either could and either place could, and in fact there will be essay questions from both this lecture and the essay and the introduction online too. So do look at that. Okay, so I think the best thing to do with Thoreau would be to jump right in and look at the Prezi. So here we are, we're moving right along time-wise. 14, notice not much left, 15, 16, and 17. 17 being an outlier here with Buddhism, but when we get to it, that will hopefully all make sense. So here we have Walden, and we're going to do some introductory things. But here we're going to be going through and looking at Walden in terms of things that we've already broached. So loco-descriptive literature. We haven't talked all that much about a critique of consumerism, but we're actually going to reach back to Sir John Denham, who we had before, and sort of a segue into Thoreau. We've talked a lot about anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. We're going to broach those two here. Talked about monism. We spent a lot of time in the beginning of the lecture dealing with dualism and how dualism has sort of been shot through the whole Western experience. Well, here we're going to see the counter to it, which we already saw introduced with someone like John Milton, but in a big way with Thoreau. Of course, genus Loki figures we talked about from the very beginning with the Epic of Gilgamesh, and here the genus Loki figure is alive and well, but has morphed into something entirely different. And then we'll do a little bit on pastoral here, so not surprising, Walden is in the pastoral tradition because it's really, looking at a non-urban kind of place and sort of constructed as opposite of the urban. So we'll look at that and how that works before concluding with Walden here. So let's jump right into first one here. A number of quotes from Thoreau. There are lots of quotes from Thoreau that are out there. I actually had one hanging up on my wall when I was a teenager, and he's good for sort of getting these sort of very concise little statements. So, I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and so Spartan-like as to put a rout to all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive deep into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. Great statement from Thoreau. But notice something here, and this is something that I focus on in the introduction to Walden, that, well, there's nothing about wilderness here, that this is a project he's embarked upon, but, it's to get all that you can out of life and to, drive it into a corner. But most importantly, I guess, is to reduce it to its lowest terms. Thoreau will come with that last statement, an even more simplified term when he just says simplify. So Thoreau, as I, have noted, is sort of the great-grandparent of modern minimalism here. But again, has very little to do in that sense with the wilderness experience or wilderness-like experience that he has. Okay, so Walden. It's kind of a difficult genre to figure out what this work is, Walden. It's part autobiography, that's for sure, and it's part fiction because not all of it is real, and it's part novel. So, like many novels, as I note here, it's autobiographical, so it draws from real life experiences. Thoreau, but it's not entirely autobiographical because, for example, he lived at Walden Pond for 2 years, but he condenses it all into 1 year to make it work better for the novel or the work, because it has these 4 seasons unfolding there. But it also resembles nonfiction. I think you can argue that because some of the chapters, not exactly what you read, but the later chapters are almost like nonfiction essays. They're sort of like science writing, talking with great description about the area, or historical writing and all. So it's really kind of one that's hard to pin down. It is certainly autobiographical. It came in part from the journal that he kept at the time, but we do know that Thoreau embellished that. So there's a classic scene where Thoreau encounters a mouse in his little cabin. And in the way it's described at Walden, there's this sort of little peekaboo game that they play, and there's this relationship that's built between Thoreau and the mouse. And it's important because, we've seen all these different ways of encountering animals in the West and all. And Thoreau really wants to have a closer relationship with animals here. And it's great. It's great that he puts that together and he adds that. But we know from his journal that that's not exactly what happened. He saw a mouse in his cabin, and that was it. But from that, he gets the idea that he could, talk about, this mouse as an experience, as him experiencing an animal and all. So, yeah, it's autobiographical, sure. And in some cases, he actually literally sort of cut out the page from the journal and put it into the manuscript for Walden. But it's different than that, too. So just to clarify, it's a little confusing in that sense as a genre. It was not well received at the time. Thoreau had trouble first writing it. It took a long time. Remember, the experience he has at Walden Pond is in 1848 to 49, but it doesn't get published until 54. He revises it a lot. But it was read in the 19th century, but not a great deal. But it would have influence on people like George Eliot and all, and the early 20th century. But it's not a generally popular piece. But that changes in the 1960s, really, in the United States, where Thoreau is sort of rediscovered by what becomes the Back to Nature generation, the hippie generation. And in part, Thoreau is not only discovered by the Back to Nature generation, he actually helps form that movement. And surprising number of people actually wanted to emulate what Thoreau did. So quite a few communes at the time, people going back to nature. I remember the very first edition of the Mother Earth News, which was sort of this back to Earth journal at the time. The very first edition had how to build your own teepee and move back to nature immediately. So it was the idea that you could do it in a sort of even quicker way than Thoreau did, and also be nomadic as well. You may also know the film Into the Wild, which is based on, of course, the book Into the Wild, and that is, inspired by Thoreau, certainly. And Thoreau is referenced in the book as well. So, yeah, not so influential until the world catches up to Thoreau about 100 years later, and then really influential in a certain way on a certain generation. So Thoreau brings together a lot of themes that we've talked about in this course so far. In part because, and I didn't necessarily set it up this way, but Thoreau has read pretty much everything that you just read, and a lot more, with the one exception probably of the description of Cookham. He's thoroughly aware of the Western tradition. He's thoroughly aware of, obviously, Christianity and that tradition, and the Greek and Roman tradition as well. And he's well positioned to take part in that conversation because he knows it very well. And it also underscores he's a pretty educated guy. Yeah, so in that sense, Thoreau is looking to the past for sure. He's aware of the past. He's contributing to the future, the past there. But he's also contributing to the future. many of the, or some of the attitudes that we have toward nature and wilderness are consolidated by Thoreau. They may be older ideas. I note here that, he reads Ben Jonson. He's taking that idea and bringing it forward in a newer, more extreme version. But Thoreau will sound very modern to us. I think that's a fair way of putting it. And in part because he helps build modern attitudes toward the environment. Again, they may have existed before, but in pulling them all together, you get them all in one place with Thoreau, and he was able to synthesize them and weave them together in a way that really hadn't happened before. So, he's looking to the past, but from the perspective of the future, and why, say, in the 1960s, Thoreau started resonating with the whole group of people, was because the attitudes that he was helping consolidate finally did consolidate in the modern environmental movement, which was 100 years later. And we're going to see that sort of second wave of environmental movements with Rachel Carson. But anyhow, Thoreau is sort of an architect of that and helps bring that together, which is why he's rediscovered. And suddenly people said, this guy figured it all out, has it all right. Well, because he helped build that attitude that people had. Just to underscore this, he doesn't arise in a vacuum whatsoever. It's the inevitable conclusion of Western thinking, and it's certainly a good turn, I think, from an environmental perspective, where so many of these issues are brought together. Thoreau, in that sense, he both brings together, sort of cherry picks what he wants from the tradition to help him, and then modernizes it as well. So it's quite an achievement and quite a milestone, I think. Scholars will look and say there are a lot of other achievements and milestones, sure, but this is a big one. Well, loco-descriptive, we've talked about this. So Walden is highly loco-descriptive, and what is the locale? It's Walden Pond. Why the loco-descriptive approach is so important to Thoreau is that, he uses it to describe this location, Walden Pond, to get you to really care about it. So Thoreau is sort of constructing wilderness for us here. It's not as I mentioned in the introduction to Walden, it's not a very wilderness area. It's just a mile outside of the town where he lives. But in the text, he constructs a wilderness, a wonderful wilderness. So you get to see this wilderness through his eyes. And as I mentioned, John Evelyn, who writes in the 17th century, you get to see the Alps through his eyes, and that's real wilderness, and it's a terrifying, horrible, horrible place. Thoreau is mediating the experience for you, and it is a wonderful place. The way he describes it is welcoming and wonderful. And if you, wonder why we find wilderness so appealing in the 21st, in part, it's because of what Thoreau did back in the 19th. So, yeah. And, it's, if you look at it's loco-descriptive, because if you look at loco-descriptive works that we looked at before, the description of Cookham to Penshurst, Cooper's Hill, upon Appleton House, Mont Blanc, every one of them mentions the title of the place that they're going to, describe. You don't have to ask what's the description of Cookham about. It's, the description of Cookham. And Walden, it has a subtitle, but in one word, it really just, foregrounds. This is the description of a place. It's Walden Pond. Yeah. I won't read this entire description here, but, you can see Walden is blue at one time, green at another, even from the same point of view. Lying between the earth and the heavens, it partakes of the color of both. And he goes on and on. So, again, with that sort of how you would know that you have a really, heavily loco-descriptive work, if you closed your eyes while I started reading through the description of Walden Pond, you could imagine it. So that's what loco-descriptive does. But what Thoreau does here, and very cleverly, we'll see He uses further local descriptive techniques to enhance this effect, but also it's all about underscoring that the place is wonderful, basically, and that the earth is wonderful. And you can see why, from an environmental point of view, Thoreau will be so important, because, if you talk about something like, environmental action, climate action, why would you want to preserve this planet? Well, read Thoreau. This was a wonderful planet. Wilderness, is a wonderful thing. This is well worth preserving. It is precious. It's even holy, the way that Thoreau will sort of recast Christian thinking to think of it. So it's really important, and I think a way of approaching that is if you had gone back to, say, John Evelyn, and if, the climate crisis has emerged at Evelyn's time, it would have been a harder sell to get people to kind of, care about the environment and do something about it. But here, Thoreau, and again, this is a culmination of a lot of thinking. We're in an era where we value the planet, and we find it intrinsically valuable for its what it was, the wildness that it was. Continuing with local descriptive, Thoreau not only has, visual descriptions, but he focuses a lot on the sounds themselves. Late in the evening, I hear the distant rumbling of wagons over bridges, a sound heard farther than almost any other at night, the baying of dogs, and sometimes against the low and discontent cows in a distant barnyard. So when you have your eyes closed and you're listening to these descriptions, it's a whole, sensual experience of sounds, and he talks about smells. He talks about everything. He's very much wants to take you there. So between the boards of this book, there lies an experience to be had, an experience of the sort of wilderness where he lived, or semi-wilderness. That is, whatever it is, even though it may not be wilderness, it sounds pretty wonderful. He uses onomatopoeia, when other birds are still, the screech owl takes up the strain, like mourning women, their ancient oolulu. The dismal scream is truly Ben Johnsonian. So, yeah, that's a direct reference to Penshurst there. So Thoreau is, even pushing it, the sounds. He can describe the sound of a wagon or whatever at night, but here he's actually, trying to emulate the sound using onomatopoeia, which he does more than one occasion. So he really wants to take us to Walden. That's something he's offering us here. Consumerism, we haven't talked a lot about, but it certainly was being critiqued before Thoreau, and Sir John Denham does it in the 1640s. So the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's what Thoreau says very early on, because as Denham had already realized 200 years before, their vast desires but make their wants the more. So, people, the more stuff we get, the more we desire, the more we, get, the more we desire, the more we get, the more we desire. It's this never-ending cycle. Thoreau identifies this as a problem with the human condition. In other words, we live this life of quiet desperation, of unhappiness, because, we have these desires that are never met, consumer desires, and then when they are met, they don't make us happy because we still want more. And Thoreau, I think rightly identifies this as a particularly big issue for those of us in the West, something that we need to address. In fact, the opening economy chapter of Walden follows Denham rather directly. So this is Denham and Cooper's Hill. I see the city in a thicker cloud of business than of smoke, where men like ants toil to prevent imaginary wants, yet all in vain. And I note Thoreau takes Denham seriously here in that he derives a way of life from this. So what is this about? Well, when Denham is on top of Cooper's Hill looking down at London, the city is in a cloud of smoke, of coal smoke for sure, but, even thicker, and this is, of course, metaphorically, it's the cloud of business that is settled on London, where men toil like ants. You might think that's a modern image, that we're like ants, and it frequently was invoked, like when you look at freeways in the LA area, like people are like ants going back and forth to work. But, that's a 400-year-old image, and older, actually. But what do they work to do to prevent imaginary wants? In other words, our needs are met for many people, even in Sir John Denham's times. But, people want more. They have imaginary wants. Where do those wants come from? Well, Thoreau is going to identify it. It's really about marketing and all. Marketers tell us that we want these things, and then we imagine that we want them. And, we try to satisfy those desires. But as Denham realized, it's all in vain, because, even if you get this stuff, it might make you happy for a short period of time, but then you're just going to want something after that and all. And you have to work, toil like an ant to get all this. Thoreau is going to take all this seriously and say, yeah, that sounds exactly right, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to toil like an ant. I'm not going to buy into these imaginary ones. I'm going to live my life the way I want it, rather than just, providing the motive power for the, consumer industry. Yep. So, critique of consumerism then, we just saw 200 years before Thoreau, so it's hardly not new there, but what Thoreau is suggesting that Sir John Denham wasn't, that we make radical lifestyle changes. So how do you thwart consumerism? How do you not be an ant toiling like this? Well, you have to object to it. Thoreau objects to this on environmental grounds. Consumerism, he objects to it on personal grounds, and he encourages us, the reader, to do so. So, what Thoreau is about here is sort of, prompting us to action. That's in part what this book is about, showing what he did with his life and suggesting that we do something like it with ours. Sir John Denham, much older, Ben Jonson, again, even older than that by a few decades. But here with Thoreau, this sounds remarkably modern. And I think so much in Thoreau sounds modern. So in the 1640s, he's attacking the fashion industry in Paris. The head monkey in Paris puts on a traveler's cap, and all the monkeys in America do the same. So we're here, the idea is we're aping what goes on. So even then, 160 years ago, the fashion industry was focused in Paris, and, the new fashion gets rolled out in Paris, and everyone in the United States wants to, to ape that, to do the exact same thing. And Thoreau is saying, well, that's, this is a problem. And he identifies, focusing on clothing, that, what are factories really about, so that mankind may be well and honestly clad. So are clothing factories really about giving us clothing that is keeps us warm and comfortable and all? Thoreau said, no, it's not. It's unquestionably that the corporations may be enriched. So if you think this project is about us, it's not. It's about the companies, according to Thoreau, the corporations. Sounds so modern, that phrase. That, they're trying to make money. That's all that they care about, and they're getting us to buy stuff so that they can make money. It's not about keeping us, honestly clad and in clothing and all. And he says specifically, kind of a funny line, but beware of all enterprises that require new clothes. So, if you have to do things that require new clothes, you should kind of wonder if you're doing that. I mean, why can't we just wear clothes that we find comfortable, that will last, and if they get a little ragged, we'll repair them or whatever. Thoreau would not have liked fast fashion. In addition to clothing, he goes to the dwelling itself, and he thinks about, the same way Ben Jonson does, why are we building these huge, massive houses? What would be the smallest thing that we could build? And he actually suggests at one point getting a shipping box from a railroad, which would only cost like $1, and recycling it. So it's basically like the size of a one-person tent. And he says that would be an adequate shelter. But he goes a little bigger with that than the actual house he builds, with the actual cabin that he builds at Walden Pond. But you get the idea. I mean, Ben Jonson, again, he had been talking about this, but if you look at the Penshurst estate, it's not a tiny little house. But Thoreau really is sort of the great-grandparent of the true tiny house movement. And that may sound like a radical suggestion, but if you remember, if we go back to um, Andrew Marvell in Upon Appleton House, where he describes the way animals lived, why should of all things man unruled, so unproportioned dwellings build? The beasts are by their dens expressed, the birds contrive an equal nest. The low-roofed tortoise do dwell in cases fit of tortoise shell. No creature loves an empty space. Their bodies measure out their place. So, you're never going to find a McMansion in a bird's nest, right? Birds don't build, nests with multiple rooms that they're never in. They build a nest just big enough for them. A tortoiseshell is even smaller. And according to Marvell, well, why are we doing this? I mean, why don't we build a place just big enough for us? Why do we go to all this trouble to make these incredibly lavish, dwellings for us? It's antithetical to everything else in nature. Nothing else does anything quite like that. And, Marvell asked the question why, and again, Thoreau takes it to heart and does something about it and builds a tiny house. But Thoreau's critique of consumerism does raise a question, because if you think about it, we're critiquing consumerism, we're talking about like where to live, the kind of clothes you wear. Well, what does that have to do with wilderness? You can wear good sturdy clothes anywhere. You can live in a small dwelling, micro apartment in the city, for example. So do these prescriptions, they only apply in a rural wilderness setting? And I think the 1960s generation that loved Thoreau so much, or some of them did, they very much thought that it was intimately intertwined with the wilderness connection. And as you noted with the introduction I wrote to Thoreau, I wanted to really break us free of that. Not that the wilderness setting isn't important and we can talk about it. Yeah, but we've talked about that a lot in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years especially. So let's talk about maybe the fact that, there's a takeaway for Thoreau, and that doesn't mean we have to go live out in a local park in a garden shed. And also, must his prescriptions be taken to the extreme extent? Can you live a minimalist lifestyle and not live in something as tiny as a garden shed, maybe a little more? But certainly, I think what Thoreau wants us to do, and I really think that this is the main project, is to get us each thinking about our lives in very specific, pragmatic ways. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the places we live, how we get around, all these things. Now, from our point of view, this is very good, right? Because all those things I just said have carbon footprints. The food you eat, you can cut it down dramatically. And Thoreau, in fact, what we'll see is in favor of vegetarianism and all here too. So this is the actual cabin, the tiny house that he lives in. It's 10 by 15 feet roughly. This is not actually the one. This is a reconstruction that you can see at Walden Pond today. The real one was here. I mentioned in previous lecture, it was discovered in 1945 by an amateur archaeologist, and they've placed these stones around there to mark it out. Oops, sorry. This is the inside. You'll see Thoreau, if you read the whole book, famously talks about 3 chairs. That's his bed, his writing desk. He has a table there, a fireplace. Not much else. But on the other hand, well, I guess we really don't need much else, do we? This is it, and a statue of Henry David Thoreau. This is it in the winter. It does get cold in Massachusetts. And I note here, you see these stones. What happens every year, more than 1 million people sort of go on a pilgrimage to Walden Pond to see the place. And right near where it is marked out where he lived, people will bring stones or pick them up around there or bring them from wherever they're coming from and put them there sort of as a nod to Thoreau. It is sort of a pilgrimage for people. We had this already. So, we've talked a lot about ecocentrism, but mainly in terms of anthropocentrism. We'll talk about both here because Thoreau is important in this regard. So both Penshurst and the description of Cookham are anthropocentric. The Penshurst is all about the house, description of all about the estate, and description of Cookham as well. And Cookham, remember, he had that very anthropocentric language, and anthropomorphic too, that the hills are on like sort of bended knee, paying homage to the homosocial group of women. Well, that is character, is sort of characterizes the era where there's that sort of anthropocentrism. Where, as I note here, the estate is largely seen as centered on the people there, and even in the case of Cookham, dying for the people there. So, as much as there's this, preoccupation with the preoccupation and celebration of the landscape in form of these two estates, still very anthropocentric. Yeah, Walden is not centered on the speaker there. It is in a certain kind of way, but remember, you have a place as big as the UCSB campus where just one person is living. So it's a very, very small human presence there. And I think Thoreau wants to communicate that in the writing as well. It's not there for the benefit of this one person. It works by itself. It is a sustainable, ecosystem there where lots of other things live, plants and animals. All life has an equal place there, the way that Thoreau wants to imagine. And he finds all that life valuable. So, again, it's very different. He's just, an extra person there. In some sense, he's sort of like the way Jacques describes the group of people, the Duke's entourage living in the forest, and As You Like It. They're interlopers there. Thoreau, I think there's always that feeling he's sort of an interloper. And I think what he wants to be, most of all, is someone who really fits in there, like every other animal. But he's not a privileged special animal in that regard. Yep, Thoreau's speaker is there for sure, but he's not a privileged part, and in so doing, Thoreau is not just writing about his account there, but he's sort of giving a prescription to us of how we should live, that, we need to reimagine the relationship that human beings have to the planet and the environment. It should not just be centered on us. In other words, we have to think about all the life here, all the species here, and how they cohabit this place with us. Thoreau is writing before Ernst Hegel, a decade before Ernst Hegel, or publishes a decade before Ernst Hegel will come up with that definition of ecology, about all life being interrelated. But Thoreau is very much in that spirit, which is why none of these things really in the history of thought and interventions are all that, much of an individual effort that other people come up with them too. But Thoreau really is sort of talking about ecology here, the interrelationship of all life, which involves human beings for sure, but human beings are not the only thing. Yep. The text itself is far more ecocentric. Descriptions, these local descriptions, are lavishly portray the environment and human characters in the text. The visitors to the place seem somewhat less vivid, I think, in reading it. So it's just clear again and again that even though Thoreau has human beings there himself and visitors to his place, it's still, they are just one group of animals occupying the place among any, and the others are very important to Thoreau. Now, that's not to say that Thoreau doesn't talk a lot about himself. He surely does. But on the other hand, he doesn't have the view that he has this somehow privileged position there. So even in the description of Cookham, it's great in this sort of Christian stewardship thing that human beings are imagining themselves as taking care of the place and all, but that gives them a very special position, right? It goes back to the Genesis account that we have dominion over the planet. Well, it's terrific that dominion is now being interpreted as taking care of the planet and making sure that it's healthy and thriving. But on the other hand, it's still very much all about human beings and, our exceptionalism and all. I think Thoreau wants to move away from that, and it's an intriguing move. It's been argued by folks like Larry Buell, an eco-critic from a generation ago, that that Walden Pond almost appears like a character in the work itself, which is odd, right? This isn't an animal, this isn't a plant, this is the pond itself. But, at one point, Thoreau says things like, "I see by its face that it is visited by the same reflection of God. And I can almost say, Walden, is that you? Is it you?" So he's actually saying, almost like talking to Walden Pond as like a person. And it does appear sort of as a character in the text. And I don't know any text before that where this happens, where you have a feature of the environment, so vividly portrayed that it almost seems like a character. And, it's visited by the same reflection of God. So why, if in Thoreau, is certainly in Christian or post-Christian thought in that tradition, why is God just there for, and reflecting on and looking down on just human beings, but not everything, since in the Hebrew account, he creates everything. It's all his creation, it's all his doing. Why shouldn't he smile down on it as well as human beings? And again, it just makes that clear that it's not all about us human beings. Arguably, no other text prior to Walden was as ecocentric. Few writers have ever imagined a physical place almost like a character in the text, and that's even after Thoreau as well as before him. So, very important person in that sense, in that the environment is not only being valued, is not only being well described and all, but it is being made central to a work. And if you think about so many novels that you read, at the end of the day, what it's about, well, it's about human beings. It's about, our human, lives going on and hearing about that. But it's interesting where, someone would sit down in a wilderness-like setting and decide to say, well, I'm not going to make it about all that. That's what it's always about, isn't it? But instead, let's make it about the place. And I'll just be, an interloper there, a visitor there, but someone who values it. Thoreau's era also moved away from anthropocentrism. So remember this hunt of the unicorn from the year 1500, where, yes, this is a forest here. It's supposed to be one, but yeah, the forest is sort of incidental here. It's all about the human action, the human presence, the symbolic human activity, all there. That's what it's about. But in other works, we saw Claude Lorraine, where he is taking, the idea of making a painting almost like a photograph, so super realistic. And note here that the human presence then is being reduced too. So yes, there are people here, but the percentage of the people here compared to everything else is a very, very small percentage, especially when compared to something like The Hunt of the Unicorn. This is Thoreau's era, and we had this actually in the introductory lecture. I gave this to you. There are two people here, and these people are the only people in the scene. And, they're experiencing the sublime, beauty of Niagara. And another example of this would be the fall of the Catterskills. So note that Durea is 1860, right after Walden was published. This is a few decades before. There is a human being here on the center, but notice that, well, it's sort of anthropocentric, and the person is, visually in the center. And you almost need to do that as an artist, because if you had put the human being up here, you might have gotten completely lost. So Cole is helping the viewer a little, and also notice how this is more illuminated than here. It's designed to draw attention to the person, but on the other hand, the project is to diminish the role of the person. And does the human presence in these still dominate the scene? We saw this one by Friedrich, where clearly it's all about the subjective experience of this sort of normative white male colonial presence in the scene. So, but something a little different with Thoreau. Is Walden still dominated by the human presence? Well, again, proportionately, if you were to do a painting, or say you did a drone view of the whole Walden Pond area, like you could do a drone view above the UCSB campus, it'd be a pretty tiny human presence there. But on the other hand, the word I appears over 24 times in the opening 4 paragraphs of Walden. It's very much about the human presence. And in a way, it's very much like that one. We have the Wanderer Above the Sea of Clouds we just saw with Friedrich, where you try to get rid of the person, and yet the person is just too big, too intruding there. Now, in Thoreau's defense, it's not, I think, coincidental that, or it's not just normal that the word I appears all those times. By the time you get to the end of Walden and you have this sort of progression and appreciation of wilderness in the place, that I, the first person, is going to be falling away again. So it's almost like Thoreau sort of dissolves or merges into the place. I think that's what he wants to communicate. Where it started off all being all about him, being all about human beings, being entirely anthropocentric, but by the end, I think he wants you to be, imagining something very ecocentric, where he's just, part of the scene, but blurring in with everything else. And it does raise a question: is this an anthropocentric or an ecocentric work? It's obviously it's a milestone text moving more towards ecocentrism or biocentrism. It's also an anthropocentric text, which because he's so big, the presence of Thoreau is so there, and even his visitors are such a big presence there. So it's certainly not a description of wilderness where he's gone altogether. So visually, I think you can imagine this in some modern documentaries where, there's no human being at all shown. So you'll see a David Attenborough film and all the shots are going to be void of human beings. So it's not quite like that in the sense of being biocentric, but it is hard to get away from biocentrism, from anthropocentrism. Even those David Attenborough films I mentioned, if you know them, they are the signature thing that binds them all together, or David Attenborough's wonderful voice and expression. So human beings are still sort of, echoing through the whole thing. So a little more on this. The question is anthropocentrism unavoidable for human beings? And Walden, I think, draws this question, what I mean, is a pure ecocentrism even possible for us, for Thoreau? And in one sense, the answer is, well, no. We human beings specifically control over 85% of the Earth's landmass for our uses, whether it's even something like wilderness that we continue to use in the United States as for a purpose, which is like tourism and all, but we use everything. So at this point, it's not like we can pull ourselves out of the scene much. We can preserve certain areas, wilderness preserve or a national park or something, but even so, the human presence is there throughout. But it does raise this question I think Thoreau is raising, the project can actually go too far, I would argue. And you see, I note here, in the 1990s, co-founder of the group Earth First, Dave Foreman, called human beings a cancer on nature. And critics responded that this is a very disturbing notion, that it kind of sounds like the way the Nazis started talking about certain people, that they had to be eradicated because they were dangerous. And in fact, Dave Foreman actually comes in an article and suggests what would the voluntary, extermination of the human race be like? What if we human beings decided that we're just bad for the planet? We're like a disease, the way Foreman said on the planet, the cancer. The solution, the right thing to do, and Foreman suggests this, would be self-eradication. We should destroy ourselves so that the planet can thrive. we may do that anyhow. It may not be, our choice, but, our civilization might collapse because of what we do environmentally, especially with respect to the climate. But in this sort of radical biocentrism, it suggests that human beings, just have this propensity to pull ourselves into the center of the picture and to make the world, work around us. And, Foreman and all says, well, that's a problem. So I note this because I think we really have to talk about sort of a balance between biocentrism and anthropocentrism, given human beings, control the planet, as I note here that we do. It's simply impossible, as I note, to separate human interests from other life. So we now are in this predicament, given our population of nearly 8 billion people, population of our species, that, we have to try to coexist with other life on the planet. It might ultimately wind up being something, what Amelia Lanier was suggesting, this sort of stewardship approach that we have to actively take, a role in helping other life and looking after the planet. And, but at least there's an acknowledgement that other life is important and that we're sort of tied up in there. And I think Thoreau very much wants to draw attention to that. He wants to draw attention to sort of, wilderness and areas free of human beings, and then raise the question, well, how do we, what's our relationship to that? So jump to monism. Thoreau really is following Milton and others here. But Thoreau very famously says, "Why has man thus rooted himself firmly in the earth, but that he may rise in the same proportion into the heaven above? For the nobler plants are valued for the fruit they bear at last in the air, and light far from the ground, and are not treated like the humbler excellence." So what's the idea here? Well, Thoreau had come up with this image, and that is, we tend to think of, in Western dualistic thinking, the body is separate from the soul, two different things. The body is sort of a vessel. When you die, the soul pops out of it, goes up with God. They're two, they're connected while the soul is residing in the body in some way. And again, Rene Descartes would try to figure out what that connection is, but the soul doesn't need the body, and it ultimately can go fly free and be with God in the metaphysical realm. Thoreau has a different image. Milton has a different image. Imagine a plant. Are we earthy? Do we have an earthy aspect, a bodily aspect? Yes. Those are our roots that reach into the ground, that are fed by the ground, that require the ground. If you cut a tree off or a plant off, it will die because it needs that connection to the earth. And also, at the same time, like a tree, we are reaching up toward the heavens. That's our ambition, is to pull up toward the heavenly. But they have to be connected. There's no dualism here, in the sense that there's no real difference between the plant. It's all the plant. But one aspect of the plant is very earthy. The other aspect of the plant is very much of the air and pulling up toward the heavens. So it's acknowledging that there's sort of a body and soul, but it's not two different things in this view. But to Thoreau especially, it's one thing. It was to Milton one matter all. And we are an amalgam, as I note here, of flesh and spirit. And, the spiritual flesh is what we are, is deeply rooted in the earth. So Milton and Thoreau is less interested in being a Christian thinker here than Milton certainly was. But Milton saw this as, a possible reading of the Bible that he was given, that there was nothing to preclude this way of thinking about it, that, as he noted, buying into dualistic thinking was really buying into Greek thinking, not Judeo-Christian thinking. Here's the idea. This is called an axis mundi. This is a view of this sort of heavenly tree. It goes back long before the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's almost back to Gilgamesh's era. And, you have that line that we had all through that one lecture. I think it was number 5. We had the metaphysical up here, the physical down here. And this line was sort of a rigid boundary, except for human beings who had both. But then we ultimately pop out and are all here. But in this view, it's an equal amount of earthy and it's an equally amount spiritual here, and that they are all connected. And again, if you cut it off here, this will not thrive and fly up to be in heaven. This will die. And that's the way Thoreau really wants to think about human beings. And as a consequence, in the Western tradition, there had always been sort of eschewing the bodily functions, right? So whether it's like eating or having sex or anything like that, those are all sort of, because they're of the flesh, they're going to be seen as temptations, right? You can like food too much, you can like sex too much and all. But with, this way of thinking, he wants to talk about, Thoreau is unabashedly going to talk about the body and its functions. And he's, what's the good life about? Well, in sort of dualistic thinking, it's all about trying to be with heaven and imagining the world beyond this one, the metaphysical realm. But Thoreau, no, it's all about here, so he's going to talk about everything from eating to worship. And you would expect that of a thoroughgoing monist. So he's, in other words, if you believe that the body is firmly part of us, and then the body must be good, part of the creation, then all things with the body must be good too, or at least potentially so. So there's nothing evil about eating. There's nothing evil about the body, because the body's good. And he, for example, will talk about eating, and he will talk about vegetarianism. And he's noting here that he rarely is eating animal food, not so much because of any ill effects that I had traced to them of animal food, so not like it's making you sick, but because they were not agreeable to my imagination. The repugnance to animal food is not the effect of experience, but is an instinct. Thoreau is actually saying our natural instinct is to not want to eat animal food, to not eat meat, that if you do, get in the habit of it, and you might think that that's instinct, and you might say, well, that's the way people have always eaten. But Thoreau's position is, no, that's not instinct. That's, that's the effect of experience. That's, you became inculcated in the culture that we're in, but it's not intrinsically, the human condition. And Thoreau will actually say at one point, let me go to the next slide, but Thoreau will actually say at one point that he thinks it's the future of humanity, that eventually, as we evolve, we will stop eating meat. He feels that's in our destiny if we continue to evolve and grow as a species, that for animal rights reasons, for environmental reasons, and just for our own happiness, we will stop doing it. He's also talks about food, and because he can focus on food as this, good thing that we should talk about, rather than like the source of evil, the way that, Dante and others would refer to it. Thoreau will focus on something like locally eating, and you probably know the slow food movement, which emerges in the really the third quarter of the 20th century, and the idea that you would want to eat food that's only seasonal and local. We kind of touched on this in one of the earlier lectures. Well, Thoreau is certainly there. That, you should only eat food that, you grow locally, you grow yourself, it's available locally, only in season. In fact, at the end of his life, one of the works he was working on was all about eating local foods and all, in a celebration of them. It's self-reliance, in the sense he's getting that from his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. But you would take care of yourself by growing your own food, by eating cooking the food that you made and projecting it, and protecting it, and then also that you would reject imported foodstuffs, and he does that. And Thoreau, doesn't like the idea of bringing tea from thousands of miles to New England, where he lives, but rather, if you're going to eat tea, why not just have local peppermint tea or something. So and I note here, in a world where food is brought to us, an average 1,500 miles for everything that we eat. Thoreau is remarkably prescient there, and I think is sort of intimating what will logically occur to other people as well, that, there's something not quite right and environmentally worrisome about transporting food around and all, when, food is available to us all. Genus Loki. We've had genus Loki figures since the very first work, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where both Enkidu and Homi Bhabha are genus Lokis. And, what does the genus Loki do? It tries to protect the environment or a specific feature in the environment, like the cedar forest, from human beings. And, the danger to the forest that Humbaba has to protect against is Gilgamesh has an unbridled ambition. And he wants to be, the greatest king that ever lived, and he's going to build up the greatest city that had ever been built, Uruk, and he needs that forest. And something has to be there to protect the forest so that it doesn't get, exploited. And that's Humbaba's job. But of course, he fails at it. He's killed by Gilgamesh. And increasingly, you're going to see human beings seen as modernity opens as genus Loki themselves. So in To Penshurst, Ben Jonson argues that Robert Sidney protected the Penshurst estate. He's the one who made sure that it didn't get overcut and all. And that homosocial group of women that Amelia Lanier talks about in Cookham, worries what in fact would happen if the protectors there were not in place. If that community of women were not protecting the place, what would happen? And their concern is that it would actually be, destroyed and die. And Milton will continue in the 17th century vein, arguing that Eve is the protector of Eden. Eden is taken care of by Eve. The animals are taken care of. The plants are taken care of. Both plants and animals are taken care of by both Adam and Eve, maybe Adam a little more with the animals, but Eve certainly is the consummate gardener of the garden, taking care of it. But in any case, this view is that human beings, this view consolidating in the 17th century, is that human beings have to protect the environment. That's our job, is what we're here to do. And again, it's interesting, this is all in a very Christian tradition, and this is why, Christian stewardship is emerging here. The narrator of Walden is clearly a genus Loki. Again, there are these early modern precedents we just looked at, but Thoreau expands the notion that a human being could be a genus Loki, implying that his readers themselves, that you reading it, you should take this project seriously too. You should become a protector of place. And, in that sense, he's, perhaps the first modern environmentalist, and he's suggesting that environmentalists are the new genus Loki. And this, inverts and challenges the traditional view. So, in Gilgamesh, the genus Loki is the problem. Human interest, anthropocentric interest have to be, are given precedence, and this, this must be removed. But Thoreau is inverting the whole thing. Thoreau, and again, building on this 17th century and later precedent, is saying that's the role for human beings. We need to be protectors of place. That's what an environmentalist is a protector of place. You have to work hard, the same way that Humbaba worked hard, and you have to fight, maybe the way that Humbaba fought, to protect the place. Now some people will take it to a real fight, right? So I mentioned Dave Forum and the Earth First group. Well, that generation in the 70s, 1970s, 80s, 90s and all, the people who chained themselves to trees and tried to prevent, forests from being cutting down and all, they're like classic genus Loki figures, right? They're like Humbaba. They're literally fought to preserve forest from the ambitions of other people who would come in and destroy them. And it does take it very, very far. And to be clear, some of that generation advocated acts of eco-terrorism, and, people died as a result of what those, some environmentalists did. So they would do things like spike trees and put spikes in trees so you couldn't cut them down. The idea that if you were to hit one of these spikes with a chainsaw, that the chain would fly out, maybe blind someone or even kill them. And the idea was that, all this was necessary to save the place. place. So it's almost like the Humbaba thing, like a life and death struggle going on. That was a pretty extreme form of environmentalism. I think most people today, myself included, wouldn't advocate for eco-terrorism. But it does make clear that, what Thoreau was advocating for, this idea of being a protector of place, would come roaring into the modern environmental movement, as that's what, human beings were seen as principally being. So, and it's interesting to think about, though, right, that, when we get to Rachel Carson, I think, as a truly modern environmentalist, so she's writing in the early 1960s, and she really kicks off what many people would argue that the modern environmental movement kicks off with her. You could argue that it really has its beginning with Thoreau and his era, but by the time you get to Rachel Carson, environmentalists are protectors of place. That's why that book, Silent Spring, is written. It's to protect the earth from a danger. And it's a very specific danger. It's the use of a certain chemical, DDT. It's not even talking necessarily about the whole range of chemicals used that way, which are insecticides, or she calls them biocides because they kill all life. But she sees a danger to the earth's places, and she is going to rush in and try to defend the earth. And again, it's not eco-terrorism or anything like that. It's by, educating the rest of us as to the problem there so that we would act on it. And she did a great job as a genus Loci, because shortly after that book was written, within a decade or so, that, DDT was banned in the United States. So, in that view, though, we've come full circle. That's what what is an environmentalist? An environmentalist is a genus Loci, is a protector of place. Although that will expand out even more when you have, say, another generation of environmentalists like Al Gore. Al Gore is a genus Loci in that sense, but remember, genus Loci, it's about a specific locale, whether it's a cedar forest or, a Walden Pond. But in Al Gore's case, the locale being, preserved and fought for is the planet Earth. It's no longer a feature of the Earth; it's the whole Earth, and that's because climate crisis. When you release, a pound of CO2 or other greenhouse gas anywhere on the planet, it affects everywhere on the planet ultimately. So it's now that we're not just protectors of places, but we're protector of the Earth. Walden is thoroughly in the pastoral tradition. Thoreau read both Deocritus and Virgil, and like Catherine Phillips and the Romantic poet, he unabashedly imagines the countryside as a wonderful place. So remember, Catherine Phillips, in her translation of Horace the Second Epode, left off that ending so that she could describe it as just a wonderful, wonderful place. Well, Thoreau does the same. It's unabashedly, it's over the top. It's a genus. It's a locus amenus. It's a pleasant place. And Thoreau, like Wordsworth, a little before him, of course, Wordsworth's in England, actually moved out to that place. So it's sort of where the literary sort of becomes real, and it becomes an actual move. So that it's not just that he's selling us on the idea; he's actually moving out there to prove that it's really a wonderful place. So, the difficulty is, as I mentioned in the introduction to Walden, Thoreau lived just a day's walk, 15 miles roughly south of Lowell, Massachusetts, which was the largest industrial area in the United States at the time. So it's like the very center of the Industrial Revolution, which is going full speed ahead in the mid-19th century. And he turns his back to it. He talks about it very little. So in that sense, you have the risk always in pastoral of just focusing on the wonderful, pristine locus amenus and not addressing the problems that was in some sense motivating it, because people tend to write a lot of pastoral when there's a lot of bad going on in the world, especially a lot of like urban problems, war and things like that. The irony here in Thoreau's case is that Thoreau is writing in the same era where urbanization is beginning to emerge in the United States. We might think of it like 100 years later, like after the Second World War. And that was being fueled by automobiles. So the car is becoming very common. So people were driving out to suburbia, and that's how they got out there. In Thoreau's era, it was the train. Train was bringing people out to suburban areas. So whole places, I guess kind of like most famously, Philadelphia has something called the Main Line. And those are communities that are outside of Philadelphia, suburban communities that come about in the 19th century because they're on the main line, the main train line out there. So a lot of people in Thoreau's era, and not just because of Thoreau, but, the painter we saw, Cole, and all that Hudson River Valley and the painting school, and a lot of others were really talking about how wonderful nature was, and people wanted to literally go out there and do it, move there. So just like Thoreau and Wordsworth, they actually did, and that was the beginning of suburbia, and that would continue and speed up dramatically in the 20th century, especially the second half. And it's the same pastoral urge. People don't like the city. They keep hearing about how wonderful the countryside is. Now you have conveyances to get you out there, first trains, then cars. People hop aboard and they go there, and they hasten its destruction. So in part, in that sense, what Thoreau's project is sort of ironically wanting to protect nature and yet harming it. And Wordsworth had the same problem. He wrote these, starting with a sort of a tourist manual in the very beginning of the 19th century. He wanted to celebrate the Lake District, and then everybody wanted to come out and visit it. And Wordsworth was mortified. I don't know this Thoreau quite realized what his role was like enough to be mortified by it in his period, in his place, but it did have that role. So you have this, twofold danger here. First, we risk ignoring and doing something about the environmental difficulties that come with human culture. Second, in running away from these issues, we may bring them to the areas we romanticize. So what do I mean by here? First, if we have problems with our urban life, then maybe we should just address those problems. In the 20th century, unfortunately, there were all sorts of issues, and some of them racial issues, like I'm from the East Coast of the United States, and those problems were not resolved. Those problems were basically not even confronted. People just ran away from those problems and left the cities when they could, and that was generally a bunch of relatively wealthy white people who left the cities, and that's a huge problem, because instead of again addressing these problems and resolving them or trying to resolve them and working it out, people just ran away from. So you can see the pastoral urge, when actually enacted, can be a running away from issues. And then there's a double problem, because not only are you leaving, bad situation behind that you aren't working to improve, but then you're taking these problems to the you're creating a host of your own problems in the suburbs too by moving there. So what had been, imagine in Thoreau's era, imagine if Walden Pond, if a whole bunch of people had moved out there, thousands of people had moved out there. Well, the wilderness or semi-wilderness would be gone very quickly, because human beings would have destroyed it. So you can see pastoral, when enacted, does have problems. One, you don't confront the problems you're leaving, and two, you bring a whole new set of problems to the place you're going. So, conclusion here. There are some questions that we can ask, the questions that remain with Thoreau's critique of modernity, and they're worth asking, they're worth thinking about. Does this only work in a wilderness setting? Could you live, Walden, in a city somewhere? What would Thoreau's way of life be like in a city? What would it be like in terms of consumption of resources, or a suburb? I think people are doing this right now, by the way. So with like micro apartments and all, people are moving back to cities. We have a little blip with what just happened with COVID. We'll see how that plays out. But certainly, the world's population has been moving to cities. 54% of the Earth's population now live in cities. By mid-century, it's going to be like 70% or so. So that's a real movement. And can you, adopting like a minimalist lifestyle, actually, do that in a city? And then, Thoreau, he calls himself Spartan. He takes this project to a great extreme. So does it have to be taken to that extreme? Do you need to live in, a true tiny house? since we've been expanding outward, we'll stay with houses for a moment in size. So right after the Second World War, the average size house in the United States was under 1,000 square feet. And that was for a larger family because we have fewer children now statistically than we did then. Today, that number is about, I think, 2,700 square feet. So it's over 2.5 times more than it was 70 years ago. And even more disturbing, there's a pretty large segment, like 20% of homes that are above 4,000 square feet and some that are true McMansions. The trend then has been to, bigger and bigger and bigger houses in the last 70 years. Well, could we take Thoreau's suggestion and not necessarily move to micro apartments or tiny houses, but go smaller and smaller and smaller, and maybe with the goal of coming back to something like, post houses immediate post-war, like 1,000 square feet, which would still be, over 6 times larger than Thoreau's house. So it's just something to think about if it has to be quite as extreme as Thoreau is. Is this, and I mentioned this in the introduction to Walden, is it even possible? So some people just, wouldn't be able to do this. And Thoreau isn't able to do it, right? He does it for a couple of years, but then ultimately he goes back to town and all. So doing it in an incredibly Spartan way might actually be counterproductive. I'm not, knocking minimalism here in any way, or micro apartments and all, but we might have to just sort of loosen things up a little, if everyone go along with it, especially with families and all too. So I guess what I mean is if it's too radical, and Thoreau may even be an example of that, then it'll be unsustainable. People will not live that lifestyle. But on the other hand, people are perfectly happy living in houses that are, a fraction of the size of the modern American house just a few decades ago. Yeah. Something else here is, what do we make of the fact that SUV advertisement promised to literally take us to the sort of places that Thoreau and the Romantic poets waxed poetically about? And this is the danger of everyone moving out to the to wilderness areas, that big suburban push that begins in Thoreau's era and speeds up 100 years later. And SUV ads, if you ever watch them, they're amazing in this sense, because you see these SUVs so often barreling through some completely uninhabited area, and you see this, the dust being kicked up and everything, and its sheer power. Yeah, but how dangerous, how bad is that, right? I mean, you're taking all this, you're literally trampling down everything with an SUV, plowing through it and bringing all sorts of problems to it. So pastoral has done that. I mean, that's a very pastoral ad. It's about us literally, escaping, modernity and our problems, some of them urban, and trying to get free of them. And SUVs promise to take you there. Of course, most people don't use SUVs that way. Most are just used in daily trips and all, but they hold that pastoral promise. If adapted in mass, would Thoreau's prescriptions actually harm the environment? So you get enough people doing what Thoreau did, they would actually, tear down the whole area of Walden Pond, and that was the suburban project of the 19th and mostly 20th century, and is across the planet has done the same. So if enough people do it, it's a problem. And I should note that Walden Pond, the pond is a very beautiful place and all, it's been preserved. But I used to live not too far from there in the Boston area. There are literally 7 parking lots that are built to handle these 1 million+ people who visit there every year. So even the Walden Pond area, maybe not the pond itself, which has been pretty well preserved, but the area is come under assault because of people wanting to go out and appreciate it. Yep. So, it's, how does this help us, Thoreau? It's a very pastoral project, right? It's a celebration of the countryside. Rather than someone like Ed Bertinsky, remember his photographs look at sites of environmental devastation. Does one approach have environmental advantages, I argue? So Bertinsky's approach, he wants to confront those head on, and he shows us the problems. No one's going to want to move to the strip coal mine that Ed Bertinsky shows us, but, that mountaintop removal scenes. But at least there's not an over celebration of pastoral places that would make us actually want to do what Thoreau and both Wordsworth did, which is to actually move to those places. So Thoreau, an incredibly important character. So much of modern sensibilities, environmental sensibilities, come from Thoreau, and he broaches this whole series of issues. And again, you can clearly see him as the birth of modern environmentalism, or as at least a key player there in consolidating it. But there'll be another second wave, if you will, what some people would think of as true modern environmentalism, which will emerge, and Rachel Carson will be the key player to that. So that's what we'll be looking at next time. Another environmentalist, arguably another Genus Loci, but a different sort of one altogether, and especially modern one in the way that we think of environmental modernity. So that'll be it for the next lecture. So take care, and I'll see you then.